host, Jonica Newby and Patrice Newell, all looking sparkling as we are getting ready to run. Let me say one little thing, and that is we are spread all over New South Wales, and we are using the power of the internet. We are also at the whim of the weather. We're also at the whim of the internet. So if things go a little pear-shaped, well, please hang in there. If you're not hearing things properly, if you've just a little worried about what's happening, you want to type in a question, please type your question into the Q&A and we'll get to that at the end of the seminar. I'm just looking down my list of people and I have a whole lot of people in the audience, which is fantastic. We are expecting some 62 people if they all remember that the webinar is on. So what I'd like to do now is to share my screen, and I shall do that here and now, and I shall go to that one and that one. Come on. And here we are. So what we're doing today is we are asking 3 people to tell us about their odyssey in science and how they have ended up writing books, and also what the business is to write a book. But the journey that I have in my mind, particularly when I wrote the grant application and received funding from the Australian government through Inspiring Australia, was in fact to have 5 seminars, each with 3 speakers, with a view to trying to attract more people into STEM, into science and technology, because those careers are very important for Australia's future. Our future in fighting climate change and our future also in working in the future. So our first seminar was in August, Fungi Fanatics, and that went very, very well. Second seminar, Chiara was one of the speakers, and 2 others were talking to us about their journey into scientific research. Then late last month, we had 3 people speaking who are all involved in science in one way or another, but they all had a common theme of bees. And here we are on the 4th of November, putting it on paper. So we have 3 successful authors, 3 wonderful people to tell you about their journey so far and perhaps their hopes and aspirations for the future. And then our last seminar will be on the 25th of November. What I'd like you to do as a member of the audience is to think about who is your mentor, who has mentored you. And if you are interacting with your children and grandchildren and talking to them about where to go and what to do in their lives, please think of finding some mentors for them, because we learn from other people. So what I'd like to do now is just to share with you a little bit of my journey. And I have there the joys of life as a scientist. I've been in science since 1967, and I grew up on farms. We didn't have very much money, but my mother, she always held out that my brother and I should study hard, should go to university. She had no idea what university was, but in fact, that was the plan, and it worked out very, very well. Interestingly, I've never had a real job away from universities. And every time I'd go back to the little country villages where we were living at the time, and we lived on about 6 different farms while I was growing up, before I even got to my teenage years. And Dad was always well known in the little town, and he'd proudly take me along because here's his son who's a scientist or a science graduate. And the farmers would look at me and say, "Oh, Tim, have you got a real job yet?" And so it went. But I had a real job. It's been fantastic. I went to Adelaide and Flinders University. I did a PhD. I was going to create a contraceptive vaccine. And basically from that, I became an immunologist. I worked in immunology in Belgium and in Cambridge, and then came back to Australia, to the University of Newcastle as a lecturer. And I've still got a desk there, which is fantastic. I've always had an interest in science and in teaching and in STEM, and indeed when on study leave in Portland, Oregon in the United States in 1978, I'm that old, in 1978, my two young children were absolutely delighted by the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, which was one of those hands-on science centres. And so I decided to build one in my spare time when I came back to Australia, and I built Supernova, which is now a centrepiece of, and continues to be a centrepiece of, the Newcastle Museum. This science journey sort of took a number of turns. As you, in academia, as you rise up through the ranks, you eventually rise to a level of your incompetence and usually go one level above. And so off I went to set up the University of Newcastle's campus in Singapore, and that's Merlion in Singapore Harbour there, 2006. They were 3 great years, fantastic. Came back to Australia and the university and ran the Tom Farrell Institute for the Environment for 8 years. Still interested in hands-on science, decided to set up a electric vehicle competition that's still running, the Hunter Valley Electric Vehicle Festival. Got all of the people who were transmitting science to the community into an association, which is HISH, which is running this event. And on the way in our research lab, Hugh Dunstan and I were able to patent one of our findings, and we have now started a biotechnology company called Innovate. But along the way, I saw that it's possible to get money from the government to take students to Borneo, and off we went to see the orangutans and the proboscis monkeys in Borneo in 2018, 2019, and indeed both Kiara and Dan and Sami accompanied me on that trip. And then in 2020, in January, I took another group of university students to Kenya, and Patrice was my co-chief of that trip, and that was fantastic as well. So there you have it in a nutshell. Science is great. If you've got a good mentor like your mother who says, righto, this is what you should do, boy, and you listen between playing football and drinking too much and all those other things, then it works. So having said that, I'd like now to give you a rundown of what we're going to do in this next hour. So our panelists are going to speak in order. So Sami will be first, the youngster, and then Jonica and Patrice, the well experienced in front of the TV cameras. Then we'll have questions and answers. But please take a photo of anything you see, because that way you can get our emails. Please feel free to contact us. And of course, please feel free to go to the bookshops and buy the books written by these wondrous people. So Sami Bayly is a graduate of a unique degree program at the University of Newcastle, the Bachelor of Natural History Illustration, where the science of drawing is taught. Sami is an honours graduate, and she had this idea to draw these beautiful animals. I don't know whether to say paint or draw. I'll say draw these beautiful animals, add in a whole lot of text, and she's gone gangbusters, winning gold in 2021, winning another award in 2021, and I reckon there'll be more to come. With that, I hand over to Sami Bayly. Please welcome her.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that, Tim. I'm going to go straight and share my PowerPoints because I have many animals to show and share with you all, and most of them are either ugly or dangerous or peculiar. And Tim said to take photos. Please don't take a photo of me right now because I'm next to a colorful bottom, and I don't think anyone else wants to see that. So my name is Sami Bayly, and I'm an author and an illustrator, and I am 25 years old, and I grew up in Port Macquarie. I've moved around a little bit, but I did most of my schooling in Port Macquarie, and we grew up on a bit of a small property where we had a bunch of strange pets, and I'm in front of one right now. This was my pet donkey. I believe this is Fabio. We had another one called Frida. They were beautiful. And we also had some miniature ponies, a Shetland pony. We had cows, we had rabbits, we had almost everything except for a cat. And so we were very unusual in that regard. And we also lived near a small zoo. And that zoo would often have some escapee animals. And one of the escapees was a cassowary. And it managed to go all the way up the road into my neighbor's yard and visit him when he was trying to put his shopping inside. So he had a bit of a fright. And so we often had some interesting interactions with animals. And I think that's probably where my love of the weird and wonderful kind of began. And after I graduated year 12 in 2013, I moved down to Newcastle, where I began my degree in natural history illustration. And I'll talk about that in a bit. And in that little gap afterwards, I have managed to release 3 books. And here they are. If you don't know what they are, I'm in front of the dangerous as well. But we have the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Ugly Animals. We have the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Dangerous Animals. And the most recent one, which has come out in the last month, is the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Peculiar Pairs in Nature. And if you haven't opened one of these books before and you're not sure what's inside or what they are about, they're basically non-fiction books aimed for children around 7 to 12. And it's set out in a way that is easy for kids to be able to digest and understand, you know, interesting facts about animals and the unusual creatures that you don't really hear about. And so each of these books has 60 animals, and they show some very, very interesting facts behind them. And here are some of my favorites. So we have a marabou stork, and it has a very large chin sac, which helps it create a loud guttural croaking sound to attract a mate. We have the Komodo dragon, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but it is a very patient predator, and it does some really nasty things with that saliva. And probably my favorite peculiar pair is this mind-controlling parasite that lives in the eye stalk. That's this green thing here of this snail, and it basically takes over the brain of this snail and tricks it into going up into the open to be then eaten by a bird, which is the plan of the parasite, because it wants to get into the digestive system of the bird to be able to finish its life cycle. So I love the weird and kind of disturbing creatures, and that's probably a good example. Now, here are some of my early artworks. So all of these artworks were done in high school, early high school. And so I've included this one, this graphite illustration, because it was my first scientific illustration, I would say. And looking in here, I can see I've even drawn a little sea louse or some sea lice in there. And I think that's perfect because it already showed that I was into strange things. And here are some other artworks as well. I tried out acrylic and I hated it. I still hate it. And maybe one day I will try it again. But it's interesting to see the progress over the years and see the differences and see how much things have changed. This was my year 12 body of work. And this is where I started getting into more realism and more maybe gory or bizarre kind of themes. And so I really loved drawing anything that was creepy, anything that people didn't typically want to see on their walls was generally what I like to draw. And so I think it's very interesting that I eventually found natural history illustration, because it is almost the opposite, where you're learning how to draw beautiful animals and plants that most people want in their houses. Now, at the end of year 12, I was at that point where I was a little bit concerned about what I would do with my career, because I'm sure, like many other creative-based people, there's a bit of a worry that you won't be able to find a job out there after school that will pay the bills if it's creative, if it's in a creative field. And so it is a stereotype, but at the same time, it can be more challenging than, you know, the average typical job. And so I was kind of getting a bit worried at this point. And it's when around this time, my mum happened to come across a degree called a Bachelor of Natural History Illustration at the University of Newcastle. And it was all about plants and animals and learning the science behind them and how to draw them, and the ins and outs. Was very interesting. And so I decided to enroll in that, and I managed to scrape through by the skin of my teeth. Could not believe it. Here is the other part of this body of work as well, some more hands. And so I decided to take a gap year between finishing year 12 and enrolling in this new exciting degree that I was really concerned about, because I was feeling, well, out of my depth. And in that time, I had a few strange jobs. I worked at a water slide park, and I sprayed sand off people's feet as they walked up the inflatable water slide. And I worked at a stationery store, a kids' stationery store, and also in a few cafes. So I definitely worked some strange jobs in that time. Now, I also thought this is probably the best time to actually try and draw some realistic animals. So here are some examples of ones that I did in my gap year. And this one you'll see above me, this shark. I think it's a quick, good lesson to anyone out there who might be doing commissions or doing their own work for someone else. Never send a full photo or clear image of the finished piece of work until you get your money, because unfortunately this one above was done for a friend of a friend of a friend for a tattoo concept, and he was paying me $50, and this is A3, this shark. He was going to pay me $50, and I thought that was, you know, I was getting so much money. I was in my gap year at the time, and I said, oh, you know, it's finished. Here's this photo. You know, do you want to meet up and you can give me the cash, or how do you want to work? Do you like it? Of course. And then he never replied. He never gave me the money. And I later found out that he did get the tattoo. So I think that's a good lesson to just, you know, it's a hard lesson, but I'm glad I learned it then when it was over $50 and not 500. So natural history illustration, what is it? Okay, I've kind of explained it in a brief way, but it is a strange mixture of art and science and everything in between, and what sort of strange things you get to discover. And it is the only one of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere. So I was extremely fortunate to only be living around 2 hours away from it at high school. So I didn't have to make a huge move to be able to do it. And you could basically choose whether you wanted to go down the sciencey biology side, and you can do more biology courses, or maybe learn about the anatomy more and different sciencey ways, or you could go down the graphic design path and learn about Photoshop and infographics and how to maybe do VisCom or something like that. So I decided to go down that one because science scared me, and I thought that I would fail miserably. And so it also had a awesome room called a taxidermy room, where you can see the skull is a primate skull of some kind, and this pigeon is not alive. It was sitting there very still for us because it was mounted and stuffed. And we also had butterflies. We had so many different creatures that we would basically go down, choose an animal, bring it back up, and we would try and draw it and be able to turn it around to understand what was happening on all different sides. So you could really learn how to look at the form and learn about the animal before just trying to draw it from a photograph. So that was very, very helpful. And in my honours year, I also went to Borneo, as Tim mentioned, and it was fantastic. The first time I had ever gone outside of Australia. It was terrifying, but it was amazing 2 weeks where we got to see we got to learn the ecology essentially of these proboscis monkeys, which you can see this top left one here, and the orangutans as well. And of course, I had to feature the proboscis monkey in my ugly animal book. And luckily, it cannot understand that it is in a book about being ugly, because it would probably slap me. But they are beautiful creatures, in my opinion, as well. And I think they're awesome. It was such a fantastic trip. Recommend it if it continues as well. Now I'm talking fast now because I'm gonna try and power through. So steps to a painting. So a question I get asked pretty often is, how do you paint an animal? You know, how long does it take? And so I've kind of broken it up into a few different points here to be able to see and kind of understand as well. So firstly, it will begin with a sketch of some sort, usually the same size of what I want it to look like in the end as well. So my sketches don't differ too much to the end piece. And then I will do a wet on wet technique. So I use watercolors. Wet on wet means that you wet your brush, wet the paper with clean water first, and then you add your paint onto that. And so that basically allows for like a dappled, very runny, kind of blendable shade that is great for the first few layers of your animal or plant. And then later on, you'll do a wet on dry, which is where you get your paint or your wet paintbrush, and you put that straight onto the dry paper. And that is for building shadows, building layers and whatnot without wanting to blend them into each other. And so it's important to allow you to wait in between those layers drying as well. And then finally, I will add some really fine details. I'll add my gouache. I use white gouache for the highlights, and I'll have a really tiny brush for all of those parts. And then the picture on the left is the scan. So I scan it in high resolution, and then I painstakingly erase the background around every hair and feather to be able to make sure it's a transparent, or the outside is transparent PNG or a file, so that it can go on top of anything else, any other color, and you don't see that background paper. So I do that because it's easy to put, if you're putting it into a book, you don't need to see the wave of the paper. Now, how did I get a book deal? Okay, I'm going to compress this as well. It's a bit of a long story, strange story, but essentially I was doing my honours. I applied for a scholarship at the Australian Museum, and I entered the ibis, or the bin chicken, because I had done a portrait of it and was learning about the kind of depressing reasons as to why it's found around bins, and that's because its habitat is being destroyed and it's left with no other choice than to go into the city to find food and somewhere to live. And so I entered that and ended up being the co-winner with another lady from my degree. And from that, I was put into the Sydney Morning Herald paper, and they talked about my love of ugly animals. And it just so happened that the head of children's publishing at HISH was reading the paper, and she saw my article about the ibis, and she contacted me and said, do you want to make a book on ugly animals? And that's how the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Ugly Animals was born. And it's gone from there. And something that I think really helped me along the way were my mentors. And firstly, I have wonderful parents who are listening now, but they were fantastic. And I think the beginning mentors for me, they were always very positive and told me that I could do whatever I wanted, and it didn't matter if I wanted to, you know, be a cliche artist, I could do it, you know, never doubt myself. And then after that, I had some more great mentors at university, Andrew Howells and Trevor Weeks, the two men there. They were my lecturers at uni, and they were such inspirational people. They were masters in their own fields of different artworks, and such great people to be able to talk to and discuss art and natural history and feel like there was a world out there for you. It was fantastic. And Kim McKay is the CEO and director of the Australian Museum, and I did get to have a few chats with her after winning, or being the co-winner of the scholarship, and it was wonderful to be able to chat to her and ask her, pick her brain and ask her how she got there, and, you know, any advice she might have had for me. And I got that opportunity because I sent an email saying, you know, I know a mentor you might be too busy to be my mentor, but can I come down for a coffee and have an interview with you and ask you questions? And she said yes. So that wouldn't have happened if I didn't put myself out there for the risk of her saying no. So that leads on very perfectly with this one after this slide. Here's a quick preview of all the books that I have. You'll see some Russian titles that's been published in Russia, the UK behind me here, America in the center, and is going to be published in a few more locations soon. So that's exciting. But finally, now these letters are from two very special people that I reached out to and took the risk, and fortunately they did get back to me. And I think this is a great example of reaching out to people you admire, inspirational people in your life or outside of your life that you don't know personally. Get in contact with them, maybe draw them a picture, write them a nice letter, and they might get back to you. So Sean Tan, a fantastic author and illustrator that I've loved since I was a kid. He was very kind to send me a letter and his book signed in return, and drew a little picture for me. And of course, Sir David Attenborough, how special is that? I have 2 letters from him. I sent him my books, and he took the time to reply and said, if you can't read that writing, he basically said, thanks for sending me a copy of Ugly Animals. In truth, he doesn't think that any animal is ugly, at least in the eyes of its mate, which is very appropriate. But he wishes me every success with the book and best wishes. So very special. Just do it. Contact someone. You can contact me if you're wanting advice about becoming an artist or scientific art or anything like that. So go out there, and you never know what might happen. So thank you. Tim, you're on mute.
Well done, Sami. That is fantastic. Thank you very much for coming along. Thank you very much for sharing with us all of your bought experience. And indeed, bought experience is absolutely the best experience, isn't it? Even though yours cost you $50. I would like now to have a look at our slides for a minute. And while we're doing that, please, ladies and gentlemen, would you put your questions into the Q&A section? So there we are. That is fantastic. So our second speaker, here we are, starting at about 7:30. So time-wise is excellent. Well done, Sami, for time. And we go now to Jonica Newby. Jonica Newby is DVM, which is, I hope I have the right abbreviations, but Jonica is a vet by her first training. She's also a science reporter, an author, a TV presenter, and also a director. And for those of you who watch Catalyst on the television, she has been there for 2 decades, which is a tremendous achievement. She's twice won the Eureka Award, Australia's most prestigious science journalism prize, and is the recipient of a World TV Award. And on the left of my screen is a copy of the book that Jonica wrote. And it's an amazing book. I read it. I must say, Jonica, that I did lose some sleep. I was reading it late at night, and it took me an hour and a half to go to sleep afterwards. That's one particular section, but you know, that was a good thing. That was a very, very good thing. So please, Jonica, would you take the stage and talk to us? Well, everybody, welcome Jonica.
Thank you. And thank you, Tim. And yeah, I think I know which chapter you're talking about. That was a chapter that was never supposed to be in the book. But I started writing a book about our emotions around climate change. I started writing it right at the end of 2019. And so the world was completely changing around me as I was writing it, which of course changed the book too. And I think you're probably referring to some of the more emotional chapters in the book, because it turned into this sort of epic narrative, which I was never expecting, because of course I live on the South Coast. Many of you are in the Hunter. and my mother lives in Malakuta. So I suspect, Tim, you're talking about the chapter called Horror, because each chapter in this book is about a different emotion. So normally I do talk about what's in the book, but I was asked today to talk about my science odyssey and how I came to write this book. So it's quite a different one to me, and I'm going to set my timer now so I don't go too far over my allotted 15 minutes. We'll see how we go, if I can do as well as Sami. Thank you, Sami. So once upon a time, I was a little girl who dreamed of grand adventures. I dreamed of walking through a cupboard and coming out into sparkly Narnia. I dreamed of being a hobbit and going on a grand adventure with all my mates and scaling, who were wizards and dwarves, and scaling mountains and confronting the beast that was there to kill off the land. And you might notice that a lot of these adventures were full of snow. I was captivated by snow, enchanted by it. I think, to me, snow came to represent adventure and majesty and high stakes and the ever-present possibility of magic. Which is kind of odd because I grew up in Perth and there was no snow anywhere there. But, you know, stories can actually inhabit your imagination in a way that transcends your real world. So I grew up, and unfortunately science taught me that I was never going to get magical powers and ESP didn't exist. So that was disappointing. But, you know, science has its own magic, and I did pursue science and ended up doing a veterinary degree because, like Sami, I loved animals. And that was great. It was a great degree, but it certainly didn't prepare me for a life in communication or even writing anything, let alone a book. In 5 years of study, I was asked to write one essay, and it was on the nutritional needs of the pig. Yes, orphanum, here I come. So, yeah, great degree, but not so good on communication. I believe all science degrees are a lot better on that now because they realise that communication is actually half the battle. So anything about the art and craft of storytelling that I've learnt since then has been learned on the job. Excuse me for a second. But look, there's a number of reasons I'm thrilled that that was my first degree, because first of all, it gave me a really great grounding in science. And a lot of people are afraid of science, which there's no need to be. You just have to sort of learn some principles. And then, look, I don't know anything or everything, but I'm not afraid of asking scientists until I understand it. I think there's that fear that gets in the way, really. And also, of course, a vet degree was a great health degree, a medicine degree. You know, really useful things like, how does the immune system work? How do viruses work? Like, why would you need to know that stuff? Yeah, it's actually really useful for life. And also, unlike doctors who are very narrow, we had to learn about all the animals, which meant you couldn't learn about all the animals. You had to learn general principles. So the way a bird works is quite different to the way a mammal works, and their brains are made differently, but they actually think a lot the same, which is fascinating. The other great thing about the veterinary degree was it was incredibly practical because, you know, we didn't have hospitals to support us. If we couldn't get a calf out, you had to sort of tie it up to something and use leverage, you know. How many science degrees actually have an entire course on tying knots? I had to learn how to throw a sheep. We had to learn surgery. And so all these things actually became incredibly useful when I later became a science reporter in television, which was actually what I really wanted to be. And, you know, I would come up with an idea like, I want a scene to look like a murder scene, and I have to film it in my own house because there's no studios at the ABC and we can't afford to pay for props. So I'd go to Bunnings, you know, but Bunnings was my props department. I'd go on Gumtree. Yeah, so I did make a murder scene. At one stage, I had to come up with the visuals to do a story on eyewitness lineups. And apparently it's against the law to even provide photos of eyewitness lineups. So I staged an entire crime scene and decided to set it on the set of Chicago, the musical. So, you know, I was all that practical can-do attitude was really useful. So I graduated as a vet, I worked at it for a few years, and then it really wasn't what I wanted to do because I always had that creative streak, I guess, from all the stories I read as a kid. And I had never learned how to tell stories, but I wanted the opportunity to do that. And it seemed, but I also wanted to use my science degree. So, you know, science reporter on television seemed to tick all those boxes. That was my dream job. And it took me 7 years, and I did a lot of free doing radio things. I got some really good advice, which was if you're going to be a science reporter or any specialist reporter, make sure you can work across all the different media. So print, radio, etc. So I just started contributing stuff, and then eventually I managed to claw my way into getting a job. And so I was, nearly 20 years on Catalyst. What a privilege. I mean, that was a weekly science show at 8 o'clock. So you're in people's homes. You got to, look, I grew up watching the predecessor show, Quantum. I've met people who grew up watching Catalyst and were actually inspired by it because we were able to be serious, entertaining, appropriate for kids, but also fascinating for adults. It really was an incredible privilege. And another privilege about it was that, of course, I was a woman on a science program. Along with a couple of other women, we always had equal numbers, which was very unusual for a science program, even internationally in those days. And also, the stereotype of women in science at that time was still, you know, you had to be the geeky, nerdy type, which is fine. You know, that's a great type, but it excludes a lot of women who don't necessarily relate to that. And we were allowed to be ourselves. So one of my colleagues was very glamorous. I was occasionally glamorous. You know, I was the sporty, active one. One young man told me about, oh, you're sporty, Jonica. I was like, what, you mean like the Spice Girls? But yeah, I was active. And so I'd surf and ride horses and do all sorts of stuff on screen. So not your typical, you know, lab geeky sort of setting at all. So it was a privilege to be a girl. And I had a lot of science teachers come up and say to me, I'm so glad you show this role model, you and your colleagues, for young women, that science is for everyone. But it was really hard at first. And it was because while I had an intuitive sense of how to tell a story, and, you know, my early stories were nothing wrong with them. They were great. But that's very different to being actually taught structure and craft. And the analogy with art is really powerful. You know, you actually do have to learn a lot of craft along the way. And so I was sort of learning on the job, but I was very lucky that about 3 years in, or 2 or 3 years in, we got a new boss. And it was the fad at the time to send documentary at the BBC, to send documentary makers to this course that was about Hollywood screenwriting, like for films. And it's a 3-day course. It's quite famous. And I was lucky enough to get to go to that when the course came to Australia. And what it did is it sort of turned what you knew intuitively and gave it some words and some structure. And of course, it broke down, and again, the story arc that we all know intuitively, which is the hero's journey. And the hero's journey just typically is you start with your hero, whoever that is, and they're going along with their life, and then something happens that completely discombobulates their world. And it could be an internal sort of upset, or it could be an external thing, like an asteroid heading for the Earth. And they then spend the rest of the story trying to get a new equilibrium, trying to get their world back into a steady state. And then they keep getting setbacks, things keep getting worse and worse. They meet teacher characters along the way. And then finally, there's some kind of confrontation with the beast that sets you on this path. And then there's a resolution during which your world will change, but also be set back to rights to an extent. And often the proper story, the hero will change. And the point about that story arc, I mean, there's lots of other elements to this kind of story thing, but once I knew that, it really gave so much freedom, because not only is that the story arc of all of our lives, in fact, there's a reason that's the universal archetypal story. You know, imagine you get cancer, you know, you go through the journey and you take all the drugs and you get sicker and sicker, and then eventually, hopefully, you hit remission or something, or you don't, you die. Either way, they're the hero's journey structure. It reflects our lives. But knowing that structure gave a lot of confidence to be very creative with my filmmaking from then on. And so I took a lot more risks, because I knew that I could always bring it home, because I had that craft. And it's my boss used to say, you need to learn the rules to break the rules. And I'm sure the same is true of art. You know, you can be a wild abstract painter, but all those really great artists all learnt the principles of art first. So that was fantastic. Now, the other great thing about Catalyst was that we got to pursue our own interests. And so I did do stories that mattered to me. And we all got to do that. You know, sure, we did some of our filler stories, but we all got to really make stories that mattered to us, because we were director, writer, producer. I bought my own camera, professional camera, and I used to actually shoot stuff as well, because I wanted the vision to really be everything I wanted it to be, and that meant often doing it myself. I did stories on the female sex drive, which was a taboo, but I still managed to do it. Cancer and exercise, after my partner got cancer and nearly died. And the cancer and exercise special feature that I made actually helped change the way we approach cancer treatment in this country. So that was really rewarding. And of course, I wrote about the climate. And I brought all my craft and creativity to trying to get outside the bubble. And a lot of the stories were positive. You know, they were about the technology that was changing our lives. For the better. And so to me, as a science reporter, climate change was this sort of abstract thing that I thought I felt powerfully about, but in retrospect, it wasn't personal. I never sort of thought about it really deep down affecting me. Now, during that 15, 20 years with Catalyst, something else significant happened in my life. I fell in love. But not with my partner, but I did fall in love with him. But, you know, that was beforehand. No, I fell in love with a place. And I call these our heart places. I'm sure, Patrice, you're in one of yours, if not your ultimate heart place. We fall in love with places the same way we do with people. And I gave a hint early in the story about who I had a crush on, which was snow. Well, about 15 years ago, I got to know Kunama Namaji, Australia's snowy mountains. And in winter, it was like a girl with a crush. I would just literally drive down there every second weekend, and I'd work every second weekend to make up for it. And I'd just be in my fantasy place all over again. And it was like every story, you know, it was magical down there. There's magical creatures. Australia's snow country is as unique as the Great Barrier Reef. You know, it's as precious and ancient. And, you know, we have wombats that make little snow caves. I've seen that. The pygmy possums, I don't see them, but I know they're hiding in the granite under the insulating layer of snow that keeps them at an even temperature of just about freezing. And without that beautiful snow, they would die. They're one of the only truly hibernating mammals we have in all of Australia. And then, of course, there's the snow gums, which I think are the most beautiful of the gums. You know, they twist and turn in these ruby and gold and silver coloured shapes, and then branch out into these leaves that coat with ice and sparkle in the sun like chandeliers. But they were separate. My fantasy world, my heart place, and my science world of climate reporting, until they weren't. So in 2017, I'd actually just finished with Catalyst, and I went to Japan for a once-in-a-lifetime holiday, and I was there, you know, I was getting powder for the first time. I was hanging out with Swiss ski instructors on holidays, hang on a second, what's a Swiss ski instructor doing here on holidays? It's January, his busiest time of year. So I asked him, and he said, I came to find good snow. And apparently Switzerland had a green Christmas that year. No snow yet. And later that week, half the Great Barrier Reef died. And I looked around at my magical kingdom and I thought, oh my God, snow. And I came home and I couldn't concentrate on getting another job or anything like that. I actually spent a year researching what was going to happen to snow worldwide and in Australia. And somewhere during that year I broke and I began to cry. And I cried a lot. And I eventually fell into a depression so bad that I went to my doctor and for the first time in my life asked for antidepressants. Now that's actually the first chapter in the book. I've told a very different story to the book because I've told you about what led up to there. But of course, that's the first chapter in the next story, which is the story of the book. I never intended to write a book about what I later learned had a word, which is climate grief, that moment when you hit that personal tipping point and you realize that it's going to affect some place you love, where it gets you in your bones, not just in your intellect. I think more and more of us are hitting that point. Many of us who hadn't hit that point before hit it when the fires came. So I never intended to write a book, but in early 2019, I found that I was talking to people and suddenly someone else started crying, talking about coral, and then someone else did, talking about a forest. And I just woke up one night in May, late May, I remember it vividly, and I went, oh shit, I need to write a book. I never wanted to write a book. I had no aspiration, but it seemed the only way to go on a journey of exploration to answer this question for myself and for others. How do I live a good and happy life under the weight of this knowledge? Now, I don't have time to tell you the story of what happened next. Tim very gracefully mentioned the story. Originally, it was just going to be a series of interviews with interesting people like Missy Higgins and Charlie Pickering and great people like that, Mike Cannon-Brookes, not the usual, scientist suspects at all, because there's a chapter on humor. Each chapter was going to be a chapter on different emotions: joy, humor, anger, grief, love. That still happened, but I started writing it in October 2019, and so within weeks, the world was turning upside down. I was living the epic hero's the epic hero's journey narrative. We were all living that. Our world had just got turned upside down, and ultimately, I found I was living the stories that I'd analyzed earlier, and eventually confronting the beast of a 20,000 foot monster fire that descended on my mum's town of Malakuta. But again, that wasn't the end of the story, because the whole point of this book was to see how you get through that emotionally, what strategies you have, how do you actually go forward with courage and joy and passion and optimism. No, but while still not falling into denial, while still, having that sense of active hope. So I can't talk here about the strategies. I will say that there's a lot in there because I am a science reporter. And so along with the gripping narrative and jokes that I've got in there, I hope that you also get everything you want to know about, what to tell your kids, how to help them emotionally, how to deal with it emotionally yourself, and that grief is to be welcomed, because it actually shows that you love the world, that you love the place. That's one thing that I really learned, and that you just have to go with it and go through it, understand what it is. Naming it is half the battle, and then you go forward with action, active hope, pride, and a life of meaning, which is totally apt because our next speaker is all about solutions, all about active hope, all about someone who has been through that journey and is busy showing us the way to the future we choose. So on that note, I will very happily hand over to Patrice Newell. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Jonica. That was fantastic. Really, really enjoyed that. And it brought back to me many memories of your book and the stories of snow. And yeah, it's something that all of us have to deal with, isn't it? That we are doing things to this planet that really are going to be very difficult for our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren. So, Jonica, thank you very much for your time and sharing your experiences. And I'd like to ask afterwards a question about what are the numbers on snow around the world, because I think that's something we should pull out of the book. But before we get to that, it's my great, great pleasure to introduce Patrice Newell, who is a member of the Order of Australia. Congratulations, Patrice, for that award, which came through this year. Patrice did a PhD at the University of Newcastle, and I had the pleasure of reading a draft of the thesis before it then went through and was passed. And so she is Dr. Patrice Newell. She is just in the business of founding a company, Koala, which is an ESG investment app. And I've really forgotten what ESG is, but I should know because my company's involved as a partner in some little way in that. Beforehand, Patrice was on television. She's now a sustainable biodynamic land manager. She produces fantastic garlic. If you go to her website, and you're very, very lucky, you might get some of this year's crop, but it sells like hotcakes. She makes olive oil, honey, soap. I've never tried the soap. She's a writer, a speaker, an apiarist, a podcaster, and clearly she is an author. You can see a whole range of books around there, and we are ever hopeful that NBN, in all of its greatness, will be strong enough to reach Patrice in the Upper Hunter. So with that, Patrice, please take the stand.
Thank you, Tim. I do hope you can hear me, everyone. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here this evening with all of you and to hear these great stories about writing and books. Anyway, great privilege to be here. That slide, I think, just proved that I'm the oldest one writing. Look, my journey with writing started as a fantasy. I was late to reading. I remember the first two books that really meant something to me. The first one was Albert Camus' The Outsider, and the second one, John Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, two books that I reread. And the reason I was late to writing was because I have a low-level dyslexia, so I always found it hard. I still find writing is something I do slowly. I tried to do a speed reading course, but the pleasure of reading slowly is something that I still carry. And as a consequence, I'm also a very slow writer. And I know that that can turn your brain around and probably trick you into thinking you can't do it. I certainly had people who thought doing something like writing was just not really my thing. And even when I read the news on SBS, I did the weekend news at SBS, and part of the deal was, you wrote copy on the news, and the really clever people in the newsroom could write a news story in a flash, and I would just be absolutely struggling. So I've always been really tuned into the difficulty of writing. But the other thing is, and it was exciting because I got the impression, Jonica, well, certainly Sami, the pleasure of writing, like creating an idea and then drawing something to go with your books, has a fun element, a creative fun element, and Jonica, driven by a great need to write. I was inspired by a famous Australian publisher who very curtly said one day, what is it with writers? People write things and they think the book is deserving of being published. Painters don't think their paintings are going to be hung in the National Art Gallery. Writers should just get used to it, write, enjoy the process, get on with it, and stop thinking everything has to be published. And that was a really important point in my life, because I suppose I had a dream of being a writer one day, had no idea how I'd ever do it. Meanwhile, I just did reading, but it relaxed me. That publisher, unbeknownst to her, relaxed me. And that was a great, great gift, because writing is worth doing just for the heck of it. You know, they call it journaling. But I do think writing is a therapy. And I would say most of my books, when I was writing them, bored me witless in the end, because writing is really rewriting. I've never, ever, ever written one sentence without it being changed at least 10 times. No word, every word gets changed. But there is something that is very deeply, well, self-inspiring, and you do feel a little bit proud when you get to the end of it. But my books, the other thing that I wanted to say was my first book, which was The Olive Grove, which came out in 2000, came out in 2000, what am I saying, 2000. But before that, I'd written a novel and I'd submitted it, and it sort of got a little bit of interest, and then I rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it, and eventually it got no, and I was pretty disheartened. And then I wrote another novel, and I worked on that, and I thought, I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. Meanwhile, I planted an olive grove on the farm, and I said to the publisher, what do you reckon if I write a book about planting my olive grove? And she said, yeah, that's probably, yeah, write me a submission on it. So I didn't have this burning desire to move to the country and write a book about planting an olive grove. It came out of the fact that I had to accept the fact that I wasn't cut out, or I didn't have the stamina, or I just wasn't able to go the full hog to be a novelist. Anyway, when I had to suddenly write non-fiction, I'd never written any non-fiction, let alone in the first person. I found it difficult, and then it nearly killed me to get to the end of it. And the other thing happened, because I'd never written such a book, I started writing a lot of other books in the middle of it. So I was always very distracted by it. I was like, it's interesting, Jonica saying, I wish I'd gone to a course. I didn't do any courses, because I was always writing, but I was writing all these other books. But those other books did form eventually into other books. And that was another thing, because I know with the books that I like to feel that the author has really deeply, deeply, deeply thought about the topic and the emotion of it, and that it has a great sense of being carried through their life, whatever the topic is. You know, it could be a finance book. I still want to feel that the author has really had a deep, deep thing. And sometimes you pick up books and you think they just thought about all this, or they're just doing a cut and paste, and they're doing something and it's got a cheap component to it. So I felt always there was so much emotion that is taken out of you. But in the act of writing, whether you're published or not, it's like you become a better friend to yourself, perhaps. You learn a lot about yourself, and you certainly learn a lot about your stamina in the course of it. Anyway, so I wrote that, and that did quite well. But at the same time, this was the other book that I was writing at the same time, The River. And lo and behold, the good thing about non-fiction, if you go down the non-fiction route, is that well, things happen all the time. You know, the world happens around you. And in this case, a coal mine was being proposed at the head of the Hunter Valley, right at the head of our river, the river I write about here. So suddenly I had another dramatic event that is having a conversation about water reform, but it was another one when they were really trying to destroy the very head of the Hunter catchment, which gave it a different depth. Now, at the same time, because one almost tune into the zeitgeist, my publisher became the absolute star publisher on all these cookbooks. Some of you, Sami, you weren't born then, but there was this flurry of cookbooks. And then there were TV, you know, this is before there were TV shows on food all the time, before Nigella Lawson, okay? And the cookbooks, they were amazing. And everybody was learning about ingredients and food and improving their skill, and they were absolutely beautiful books. And I said to Julie, I said, we've got to do one for agriculture. You have to do it for the, you know, the foundation of the food sector, not just the cooking end. Right? We need one for farming. And so we did this with a photographer. He took this beautiful picture on the cover, Travis Peake, where we did do that. And it's probably my favorite book. It's only 20,000 words that I had to write. That was a good thing, less words. I love that Elizabeth Barrett thing. I'm sorry I sent you such a long letter. If I had more time, it would have been shorter, right? Short is good, right? Every word matters. And so next I did a cookbook, and then eventually, just when I thought I'd never write about agriculture again because I was so upset with what's been happening in the ag sector, agriculture is the third biggest carbon emitting sector after energy, electricity and transport. And yet we were never able to say anything mean or nasty about the ag sector. You know, they were farmers. They were the good people. We had droughts. There were all these problems going on in the regional areas. So we couldn't possibly engage that sector enough. And that felt wrong. And you'll see just with the latest things that are being discussed. So eventually I thought, I can't write about the farm forever, but I have to frame it more in climate change, because many people, it certainly was in the drought, you know, farmers are sort of regarded quite often as mavericks, as if they're out there, you know, on their horse and their hat, and they're out there doing it tough and against the elements and pioneers, and it's all about that. And yet farmers never farm alone. You know, we farm with a community, and it was through this idea of needing community to really tackle the big issue. So that's why, who's minding the farm? A lot of people are minding the farms, and it's all of us that in their little parts of the narrative of agriculture that hopefully, and this is a personal book, it's not a technical book, but I felt the need, because often when I meet people, it is surprising to me what they don't know about agriculture. So that's the driver for doing that book. Now, I just have to say here, Tim, ESG, okay? ESG, environmental social governance. And these are important things now, and why I'm stepping back. I'm not leaving the farm, but I'm stepping back from agriculture to focus on finance, because money, as much as we don't want to admit it, makes the world go round. And I want to see every dollar spent in things that are leading us towards good climate solutions. So I might leave it there. Can you hear me? Can you hear me still? You can. Okay. I fear we drop out quite a bit with this bad internet. Okay.
No, that went very, very well, thank you, and clearly, and it raised a lot of thoughts in my mind. Thank you, Patrice, for sharing all of your thoughts with us. And certainly the ESG is something of the future. I look forward to further developments in that when we've all got the app on our phones, indeed, and we can all do things there. So let me just see where we're up to. I want to share my screen again for a minute, ladies and gentlemen. So we go here, we'll share our screen, and now we'll wait a long time while it goes to slideshow. And we're in slideshow. So those were the books of Patrice Newell that she was talking about, written on her farm of so many thousand hectares in the Upper Hunter. So she's in my view, a big farm. I don't think I ever lived on a farm that size when I was a boy. What I wanted to do, though, was to put this slide up before we have some questions. And I'd ask you all out there in the audience to take a photo of this slide, because here you can find the details of all of our authors. There's Jonica, there's Patrice, there's Sami. The books are available, and I'd well recommend that you buy them. If you have young people, then go for the encyclopedias. They are fantastic to look at, as well as full of really, really good stuff. Sami, I was amazed by the facts and the factoids that you put in there. The really, really good biology. Fantastic. Not sure how a natural history illustration student can do that compared to one of my biology students, but it's fantastic. And in the middle of my screen, I've got Patrice Newell. Patrice, your book, Who's Minding the Farm, is really so pertinent and so interesting to read. It's a bargain at $28.35. Not the cheapest of books, though. We go over to the right-hand side there. There's a really cheapie there, one for $24.75. Jonica, your book is fantastic. And all I can say is thank you very much, ladies, for sharing with us. Now, I have a co-host, Kiara. Kiara, what I'd like to do is take the host's privilege of asking the first question. So let me do that. And it's a question to Sami and Jonica and Patrice. And indeed, it's about climate change. We've had these dreadful bushfires and droughts, and now even the Weather Bureau is saying this period that used to be called spring here in New South Wales is now the storm or tornado season. I couldn't believe it when the weather people were saying, oh, we're entering into the tornado season. So things are changing. My question in three parts. Sami, I'd like you to talk about climate change and the effect on the ugly animals. Jonica, could you talk to us about snow? And Patrice, water on the farm, what's climate change doing on the farm? So Sami, perhaps you're first, you're the youngster. What about these ugly animals? Where do they go? What do you see as an important thing for our audience to know, or what's in your heart?
Yeah, well, from the beginning, I learned so much, and I'm still learning every time I make a new book, and with all the research that comes with it, I'm gobsmacked. And one of the things that I think I was most kind of captured, but also a little bit traumatized with, was when we did go over to Borneo and we were learning about the palm oil and how much of an impact palm oil plantations have on the animals within those areas, and one of, or two of them are the proboscis monkey and the orangutans. And so I think we were able to go over there. We were able to go actually into a few of the palm plantations and see the big trees and the big huge seed pods, and they would cut them down, and they were so big and heavy, these seed pods, that I think if you were unlucky to be under one, it would probably nearly kill you. That's how heavy they are, full of all of this oil. And so that was so shocking, and it was really important for me to be able to understand what sort of an impact clearing land, clearing natural native forests and rainforests of, you know, where hornbills live, where the orangutans are climbing through, or the mangroves where the proboscis monkeys are, clearing that, and especially the proboscis monkeys, they're having fewer and fewer areas to live, is having this, you know, terrible, horrible, you know, cause. And it is doing, you know, it's so important for kids to learn about this, especially because they are the ones that are going into the new generation to be facing these really depressing things if we're not careful. And so I really wanted to make sure that I included the conservation status in all of my books, because it is, for me, it was a really important aspect that kids learn about, kids understand the different types of conservation status levels and what that means, and also why they're at risk. So a lot of the time it is human induced, and it's humans clearing or destroying habitats, which leads to their numbers falling. Also to do with hunting and poaching and or, you know, consuming too much. And so yeah, I could talk about it forever, but I'll pass it on to the next one.
Thank you. My next one is Jonica and snow. Tell us a little more about snow, please, Jonica. Where are you, Jonica?
Oh, I'm back.
Hello.
I've got good internet, so. Oh, it's saying it's unstable. I'm just going to open the door just in case that helps. Okay, sorry. Yes, I froze there. Good thing it didn't during my talk.
Yes, you're on, Jonica. I wanted you to expand a little bit on what is happening to snow, because I was really amazed by the figures you had in your book as to just, we know the glaciers are disappearing, but you made the point about snow across many, many continents.
Yeah, I almost don't like to share that. I know I have it in the book, but it is, that's why I emphasize that I tell a story, because all these bits of news, when you really confront them, they're just so overwhelming that they actually they deliver grief and make a lot of people want to look away in denial, which is one of the reasons I don't often talk about what I actually found, and I just put it in a very small section right at the beginning of the book. But yeah, so if we don't reduce emissions, if we stick to our current trajectories, and obviously we're in a decade of incredible flux now. I mean, the pace of change and disruption, many of it positive, absolutely, over this next 10 years is going to be extraordinary. And it's a story we don't know how it's going to turn out. But if we don't turn the ship around, basically toward the end of the century, even the Alps, there's virtually no snow on them, only on the highest peaks, and that's above where people currently ski. And people tend to think of skiing, but of course there's this huge cultural link with snow. I talked about, or alluded to it in the beginning, about how our fairy stories are so soaked in snows, because so much of Western culture has come from people who been through ice ages, you know, and actually would have winters where there's a lot of snow. Well, it snowed much more in Australia in the past. The Aboriginal people live with snow. Anyway, so the prospect of that more or less gone in the Alps is just horrifying. In America, predicted to lose about 60% of the snow. Australia, I don't even want to really tell you, but there's basically a graph that shows the snowfall over the snow season as it is now and as it was over the last 30 years. And then you get to about 2070 because you can't really fine tune it. And by that point, it's flat. So
it's all gone.
Yeah, it's all gone. And of course, that doesn't tell you when that tipping point is, but it's like coral, you know, there's a point where snow becomes rain. There's a point where coral becomes dead. So obviously I put my active hope that we will turn the ship around and that there'll still be snow in 30 years. But I don't want anyone to be depressed or overwhelmed by that. That's the grief that I've had to contend with and confront. A lot of my friends won't even contemplate it. But I think you need to face the truth in order to emotionally deal with it and work out, well, now what? Because otherwise you just bury your head in the sand. And really the book is all about how to deal with reality without being overwhelmed by it and actually finding positivity and optimism to go forward into the future.
Thanks very much, Jonica. So the third part to my question was directed to Patrice, and I was just intrigued to hear your thoughts. I know you're part of an international group of water keepers who are people who look after rivers and their own rivers in particular, and you as a farmer have very important rivers, river land, and so some thoughts from you, please, on climate change and the farm or on the farm.
It would be true to say that, thanks, Tim, it would be true to say that you can grow anything anywhere when you apply water and fertilizer. And that's been the great tragedy, that people have just thought if you can add any sort of input, you can sort of treat the land, soil, as just a medium in which to do whatever you want and destroy the biodiversity, you know, pollute the rivers if you want. So the recklessness of modern agriculture is so beyond shocking. And now that the weather patterns are so variable, and we know, because it's just a fact, the Murray-Darling Basin has taught us so much with all the hoo-ha and fighting that's gone on there, there isn't enough water for the agricultural ambitions that many of those in agriculture have. Therefore, how do you break that down? For me, as a land manager, the hardest thing is learning to accept that what you want to do on your land, you may not be able to, because people impose their own ideas. You know, oh, I want to grow rice. Well, guess what? It may not be suitable to your land, or I want to do whatever. Trying to match the product with the land that you are actually managing is becoming increasingly difficult. And I know when I see lots of farmers and, you know, they might be standing in a paddock, and I just think, why are you even living there, let alone trying to grow something there? But you can't, it's very hard for even me, and I'm pretty loud about these things. It's a very hard thing to say, because people are attached to their land and they usually want to do what they've always done on it and continue to do it. And so there's this weird thing going on about they have rights to allegedly, supposedly continue doing what they've always done, with or without water, you know, not improving it. So it's pretty challenging times. And it's been just down here in our neck of the woods. You know, I live in Barnaby Joyce's electorate. He is not a big believer in a lot of the fundamentals of climate change, and that has quite a big impact on the type of narrative that gets discussed locally.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Stop there.
Yes, yes. Well, I'll stop the sharing, and I will ask if we have any other questions. Where's my Chiara gone? I
certainly do.
My view there.
Thanks, Jim. So I guess my question is, you all approach different areas of science. Sami, you talk about biodiversity, Patrice, you talk about agriculture, and Jonica, you talk about the emotional response to various elements of climate change. And what would be your advice to an individual on how they could reasonably and realistically approach climate change and what they can do on an individual level?
Can I have a throw in on that?
Absolutely.
Okay, because as I said, I didn't really end up talking much about some of the ideas in the book, and also more that's come out, because it was such a personal thing writing this. It's actually a very personal book, which is not what I set out to write. But of course I had to let it out into the world, and then I've been talking to people about it and so on. And one of the metaphors, I don't tell you what to do, but I do talk about how to think about how to go forward. So first part is name and acknowledge the emotion. This is what the psychologist said to me. Let's say it's grief or anger. Anger is a stage of grief, etc. Use that as a sort of accept it, acknowledge it, use that as a sort of launch pad for what you do going forward. You know, it's part of the sort of acceptance thing. And I ended up, there's a reading that I normally do in talks, which is from the book, that I call Nick and the Disaster Movie Dash. It's from the Malakuta chapter, where you hear these individual voices talking about that one day, and it kind of weaves together as this narrative. But when you take it out of and just read Nick's story, it ends up with him just doing this incredible sort of, you know, he's staged to defend the house, and he sort of dashes down a corridor of fire, and then the fire chases him down the beach, and he runs on the beach, and then the fire chases him along the beach, and he can't go that way, and then he gets back to his bike, and his bike's been burnt to a crisp, and he sprints around the back, and then he picks up his 2 buckets and keeps fighting the fire, when at that point the fire gets worse. And he finishes talking about that story by talking about, I'm just a person with 2 buckets. And I've actually used that since, and I've gone, oh my God, that's just such a powerful metaphor for all of us with climate change. We're all of us just a person with 2 buckets, faced with the overwhelm of this, in that case, fire, but the overwhelm of global warming. And so all you can do is bring your own buckets. And you know, some people have got really big buckets. Mike Cannon-Brookes is actually bringing buckets of money to trying to create solutions. Patrice, you're doing amazing things with what you're doing. Some people are just me, you know, a little sort of writer, artist, whatever I am, I don't know. But you bring your buckets, and that's enough. There's a quote from Gandhi, you know, whatever you do will be insignificant, and yet it is essential that you do it. That is enough. And then if you want to take the metaphor of the 2 buckets further, I actually break it down this way. So in one bucket is the things you might do personally in your life to try and live a life within values. So that might be getting your solar panels. It might be where you source your power, looking at changing the money over gradually. None of these things can be done instantly. I think I'm sort of making a commitment myself to just review regularly where my money goes, and if there's a better option, do that. No one can be perfect. A lot of people are changing their diet, but don't judge others for their own personal choices, because the second bucket is what we do collectively. And for most of us, that's actually where we can have the most impact, joining activism groups or whatever. And there's a particular philosophy in the book that is from Jonica Newby, this eco-philosopher. And she talks about active hope, which is the action, your gift of what you do to create the future you choose, which can be very small. It might just be the book or talking about it, which is one of the things I'm doing currently. But to do that, you catch an inspiring vision. And it may not be the same vision as everyone else, but it might be that you want to contribute to this group who are doing that. And I think that way it kind of allows you to go forward and choose what you want to do for it without just trying to keep this burden of guilt, which I grapple every day. Like I look at everything and go, oh my God, is that going to landfill? You know, it's hard, and you've got to be easy on yourself and sort of have a strategy about how you think about it. That's just some of the strategies that I worked through in the book.
That was awesome.
Sami or Patrice, a short answer, please.
Yeah, I'll go nice and quick. I think because I'm working with kids, I try and break it down to be a bit, to try and be simple and work within their own homes. And well, personally, I don't eat meat. I'm vegan. And I think that, you know, for me has a big impact on what I'm consuming. And so that's my effort as well. And I think for others, small things you can do is look at your recycling and make sure that you're recycling properly and you're doing the right thing with that. Look at what you're purchasing, like you were saying about, you know, are you buying too much waste, the stuff that goes in landfill, and really just look in your own home and just go from there. And I think you can make really small changes that don't feel too drastic and too overwhelming, that will make a difference.
Patrice?
Well, I share all those views, and the important one of, not being judgmental as we all transform ourselves. We're all human, we're all imperfect, and we're all on a journey, and we're all experiencing in our unique way, because we live in different areas that are experiencing it in a different way, the impact of climate change. Just even if you think of COP at the moment, one of the leaders, I can't remember who, said, oh, it's all going to be solved by the technologists and entrepreneurs and blah, like the big blokes at the top, with the solutions. And I didn't pull all my hair out when I heard that, but I thought, how many times do we have to think, a savior, a bloke is up there sort of, giving us this sort of simplified answer. And so, no, I believe it's all of us, because we're sharing it, and every act and and women are very good at this, I think, in terms of, being true to the feeling of it, and also the fact that politics, because I tried to get elected to government. I failed, but I'm interested in politics and I follow politics, and I'm sort of not scared of politics, but that we do have some political engagement, because we have elected all these people that don't believe in climate change, and we really should not elect them if we want to get a good solution for the future on this. So that's another important thing. Politics matters in the climate change debate, as well as our own personal decisions. So that would be my other addition to that.
Chiara, could I just add a little bit as well? Mine is really a plea for science, because the public has to believe in the science. We're seeing right now with vaccines and vaccinations, a whole lot of people are totally ignoring the science, and how we can get people to believe the science is really, to my mind, at the crux of then how we get politicians elected who are going to do something about climate change. It is believing the science and not the spin is for me the absolute critical thing. I'd like to wind up our beautiful session today with just some words, some thoughts on the question that Janie has put in. I'd like to hear from each of the panelists about the Glasgow summit. Do they feel hopeful we'll get to net zero, or distressed, disappointed? I'm not sure what the rest is, but a good question. Thanks, Janie. And so a short answer from each of you, particularly Jonica. Short answer. Okay, who's first? Patrice? No, Jonica's not first. Sami?
Go fast if you like.
I'll be quick.
Patrice.
Am I going? Here we are. There's been a lot of these other conversations. Sorry, am I butting into you, Chiara, there? I'll just finish. It's easy to be disappointed because we've had many of these other groups before and they've failed to have good outcomes. So I probably didn't have a high expectation. But even if it is negative, if it just ends up being a lot of gaseous stuff, and I love the idea of the world coming together. Like, I know a lot of activists that are there, and I love that. I love the fact that they're there participating and sharing in this important discussion. Therefore, no matter what happens, I'm going to feel more hopeful because I have to. I just have to. Because otherwise, you know, it's slash your wrist time and I won't go there, even though I sort of have moments of thinking it. So there you go. No matter what happens, I'm okay and I still feel hopeful. because a lot of good people are still doing good things.
I'll go along with that as well quickly. I agree. I think you see the news and you see the updates, and it's really easy to feel sense of doom and gloom, and that, you know, our current leaders or some of the bigger leaders are driving us into the ground, and you kind of want to grab them and shake them, and you want to swap them over for other people who know what they're doing or who care more, or who see it a bit more seriously. And so I try my best not to get overwhelmed, and Jonica, I'm sure you'll be able to, I should talk to you more about it, because I find that sometimes it's easy to become depressed about thinking, you know, what the future's going to look like, and researching for the book, and then you're trying to explain it to kids, and, you know, you want to be truthful to kids, but you also don't want to depress them and tell them that things are dying and it might not be around for when they're adults. And so I'm trying my best. So yeah, I've got my fingers crossed.
Yeah, look, there's so many ways of thinking about it. I'm just trying to pick one, but yeah, like Patrice, I've learned not to invest all my hope in an outcome that probably won't happen. So what I see is how much unbelievable turmoil, and I think COVID has actually, believe it or not, contributed to this in a positive way. I don't mean the fact that it's reduced emissions, because that was barely noticeable, but it's made everyone much more aware of the possibility of disaster, of real disaster, of epic scale disaster, coming straight on the back of fires, floods, and all sorts of disasters overseas. I think we're yet to see the emotion. We're starting to see real emotional tipping points with leaders overseas, where we will look back from 2030 and go, yeah, actually 2020 was a huge turning point. And we can't necessarily see how this story ends up now. But I suppose where I have my hope is that I'm a lot more hopeful now that in this disruption and turmoil, that we're actually going to gradually, despite the blockers, and we can name some in our own country, that these two strands that are going together, this on the one strand, the strand of collapse, and on the other strand, the strand of renewal and change, that these two are kind of fighting it out. And I have to hope, like Patrice, we all do, you know, we're still going to have a world. We're still going to do our best with it. So we just go, you know, rooting for the renewal gang. That's what I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I've decided that we're past our use by date. It's 8:33 on my clock. We've worked very hard over these last 90 minutes to bring a story. I think we've brought 3 beautiful stories to the world. So speakers, thank you ever so much for putting your time in and sharing your thoughts so well. Each of you has given me a new dimension to think about, and we've still got a whole string of attendees who have stuck with us to the end. So to you, audience, thank you ever so much. Please spread the word that we have another seminar coming up on the 25th of November in Eventbrite. Just look for Odyssey and you'll find it. And if any of you want to make contact with us, please do so. Any last words, panel?
Thank you.
No last words.
Yeah.
Thank you. Over and out.
Thank you.
See you, everyone. Bye.
And to my fellow panelists, I've so enjoyed hearing your stories. It's a very different discussion and format to some of the ones I've done. I'm sure it is for you guys too. And I've loved it. I loved hearing your life stories and journeys, and yeah, it was great.
Right back at you. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye, everybody.